If you ever felt like you didn't belong here, this might be why. So let's talk about it. So, with all of the conversation these days talking about disclosure, I thought it would be a good idea to talk about the different beings that are here on Earth. But before we get started, I just want to say the awakening process is very confusing and it can be just really earth shattering for some people. And I think that's the reason why it's taken this long for disclosure to happen. And I have no idea how much they're going to disclose. But the whole truth about the whole alien story, there's a lot to it. And I really think that they have been trying to do this kind of drip, 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 trying to get people used to the idea of aliens. But I just want to say that I've been on this journey for 10 years and it has taken me a long time to understand the whole picture. And obviously, I'm still learning new things every day. But I just want to say if at any time during this video or any time during your awakening process that you find information that is hard to fathom or it's just too hard to listen to, that you don't have to listen to it, that you are in charge of your own world and your own reality. And so you can always just, not listen to it. And that includes if there's anything in this video that you find uncomfortable, you can just go turn it off and, watch something else. So during my awakening process, there were things that I found out about, and it really changed my entire outlook. And I think it is very difficult. You will hear a lot of people talk about the dark night of the soul, and I did have that 10 years ago in March of 2016. I remember it clearly, and I did write a blog about it. I will link that in the description if you want to check it out. But what ends up happening is everything that you thought was true ends up not being the case a lot of times. And I think what happens is it really affects your psyche. And, I wish I could talk to a psychologist about it to kind of understand psychologically what's happening, but it can be a difficult process. So I wanted to say that before I start talking about this because I don't want anybody to feel that this is uncomfortable for them. So if you come across this information and you don't want to hear about it, don't want to know about it, you're more than welcome to turn it off and, go listen to something that feels more comfortable for you. But this is information that I have gathered over the decade or so that I have been awake, and so I wanted to share what I have learned about the different beings that are here on Earth. All right, so let's get started. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about this concept of the starseeds, so we'll talk about that as part of this conversation. And if you're interested, you can go back and look at that video. But when it comes to the actual human beings, people that look like humans, the thing is that you have to look at it from a soul perspective. So even though we have earth bodies, our consciousness, our soul may have been either originated on this earth, which you have to, understand and know about the concept of reincarnation, which is that you have multiple lives that you go in and you go out of different incarnations. So that's kind of a thing that's kind of understood. So I will do a whole video on that at some point. But basically, you have your earth body, and your soul may or may not have originated on Earth, or it may have originated, starting to have incarnations on other star systems. And so there's a concept that some of the humans that are here on Earth have only incarnated here on Earth. And so those humans would be basically called Earth-based humans. Now, the next type is what you would refer to as starseeds. So starseeds are people that we are humans, but our soul's consciousness is not normally incarnated here. So our origins have been on other star systems We've had hundreds, if not thousands, of lives on other planets. And so we basically volunteered to come here during the ascension process and help with the Earth as it's going through this evolution and help out with the planet, the human beings here. And so our souls are not normally incarnated here. Now, obviously, we probably have incarnated several times because of, you think about Egyptian, Atlantean, Lemurian. I mean, we've all probably incarnated. If you're watching this video, most likely you've incarnated into those times as well. And so we came down here, we're incarnating in this life to kind of help with this process. And so you will hear this term, starseeds. You may also hear them referred to as interplanetary beings. You can also hear them called light workers. And then another thing that I've heard recently is the concept of hybrid humans. Now, I don't know exactly how they're referring that, but I have heard that term before. But I think, a lot of us, we have a higher frequency, and I think that that's kind of something that is maybe obvious to other people. That, some people just feel like their energy is higher. And so I think, with star seeds, you will find that there are a lot of them, they just have a more higher vibration, a more intense kind of, I don't want to say aura, but just kind of feeling about them. So when I talk about star seeds, there is that concept of the beings that are coming from other planets and coming here. And so that would also include beings that are not necessarily of a positive variety. So that would be like reptilians. So, and not all reptilians are bad, but some of them are. And so they would also be beings that are from the reptilian, family of extraterrestrials, but they may incarnate also into a human body. So those are two groups. Now, I would say also that kind of the names of these are not necessarily as important, but just to understand the concepts of, the big picture. Because I think, before you wake up, you just think, I'm a human, I'm walking around, blah, blah, blah. And, maybe you felt like you're kind of like, I don't feel normal, I feel like I'm a little different from everybody else, but I don't really understand why. And that's why. So this is a very low vibrational experience, and it's difficult for a lot of people. So just keep that in mind. You're not the only one. And then there are other types of beings that you may have heard called shapeshifters. And I believe that these are actually extraterrestrial beings. So from what I've gathered, they are reptilians. There may be other types of beings here that do this, but what they're doing is they actually have an extraterrestrial form. So they may look like, lizards, the lizard people. I mean, we've all heard of them. But what I understand actually is happening is why they look human is because they have a capability to be able to kind of make us think that that's what they look like, that they look like humans. And so I believe this is a type of psionic ability that they have, that they can kind of make a projection and interact with our brain, and it will look like they're human, but underneath they're actually a reptilian. And so when you hear the term shapeshifter, they're not really shape shifting. It's just that they are creating this, kind of field around them to make it look like they look human. And, there may be others that do that. And so one example I can share that I've heard about was, these types of beings that went in, and they were not reptilians. I don't know what kind of beings they were. But they went into like Las Vegas once, and everybody, to them, it looked like they were normal people. But the camera caught that, they weren't able to manipulate the camera. And so the camera was seeing something that was totally different than what everybody else was saying. So that's one example. And then I think the camera got cut off because I think somehow they realized, oh my gosh, they can still see us. So I think they manipulated the camera at that point. So that's an example. And I'm not sharing this to scare anybody. I think that, we hear about this. I personally have never experienced this. Oh, I also want to say about the shapeshifters. It's my understanding that the ability to project that and interact with other people, making themselves look that way, I think that only lasts, like they can only do that for 3 or 4 hours at a time. And so that's one other thing I heard about that ability. And then there is the concept of clones. So, it was kind of funny because I was talking to my neighbors one day and we were just having small talk, and they said they were watching a show about clones. And I swear I kind of was like, what? Like, you're watching a show on clones? I've heard of clones, but I certainly wasn't aware that that is a normal thing that's out there. And I think that's what happens is they basically put this information out there to kind of get you used to the concept. And so I think that's what was happening. I don't think my neighbors are necessarily awake or even thinking that this is real. It's just like, a science fiction show to them. But it is my understanding that they do have the capability to clone people. And so what ends up happening in that instance is they take the consciousness of one person and they can split it into, several different clones. And it's my understanding that it gets difficult the more clones that you have for them to be like functional. And the other thing about that I've heard is, they have the capabilities to completely heal people if, their bodies are, destroyed in certain ways. And this happens to go into a whole nother area, so I won't go too much into that area. But it's my understanding that if that happens and somebody's body is damaged beyond repair, then they can actually clone that body and put that consciousness in another person, in the clone. But at that point, that is no longer a clone. It's them, because their whole consciousness is in that body, even though it was recreated from their original. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing, but I just learned that recently, so I thought that was interesting. So now let's get into, so these are the beings that are walking around on Earth, and then there are some beings that are underground. And this whole concept has been around. I've heard about this for a long time, but basically it's my understanding that what happened when the flood happened, I believe 12,000 years ago, which is in the Bible, when the earth was flooded, there were people that were living in Lemuria, and they had escaped. Some of them had escaped the flood and gone over to Mount Shasta. And so I believe they have a civilization under earth, and they are, I believe, referred to as the Agarthans. They look human. I believe their origin is from Lemuria. Hopefully I have that right. But it's my understanding that the earth is basically all of this caverns and huge areas and tunnels. Like, it's not just this big solid rock like we think. And I was just watching a show the other day where the late William Tompkins was talking about that. So it is interesting because there apparently are these huge spaces underground. I've also heard of ant beings that live underground, and I think I found out about that last year. So that was kind of surprising. I have heard of ant beings before, but I always heard of them like, out and about, out in outer space, not necessarily here on Earth. But apparently there are ant beings that live underground, and they are, 6 feet tall. And one thing I do want to talk about is uh, when you hear about different extraterrestrial races, you will hear the term 5-star pattern. And so that refers to a being that has a head, 2 legs, and 2 arms. Now, the rest of it, could be completely different. Like they could be, different colors, they could have different types of bodies. There's all sorts of, different types of ways that could, play out. So there's those two. Now, I'm sure there are others underground, but those are the ones that I've heard about. I've heard of others, but, I don't want to get into all of that. And then there are also, which I'm sure everybody's heard of, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Yeti. So those beings, I don't know too much about them, but I did have one experience a long time ago, and I'll share that in another video. But I believe I believe the term is interdimensional, and so that is why they are able to disappear. So the reason why people see them and then they don't, it's because they have that capability. And I think they are just one of these types of beings that came here to have an experience on Earth. So what they are evolving to, I don't know, but I think that's why they're here. I believe there are also extraterrestrials that live in mountains. I've heard several different stories about people seeing different spaceships coming out of the mountains. And of course, we've heard about UFOs underwater. But again, I don't know that much about that. I just have heard of that. Now, when it comes to the different extraterrestrial beings that do visit here, I'll talk about what I have learned over the years. So there are grays, and these are non-biological. So they have a consciousness, but it's my understanding their body is not a normal, typical body. They're like artificial forms. So they did away with bodies and they just put their consciousness into these artificial forms. And I believe they're about 3, maybe 4 feet tall. They're not very big. And then there are EBENs, and that stands for extraterrestrial biological entities. So this is the type of alien that was found in the Roswell crash. So they are biological. They do look like the typical grays, but I think they have more of, they're a little taller, they have a bigger head, they kind of have like more almond-shaped eyes. But there was one that was alive, and I think I'd heard about this several years ago, and so they kept that one there for a few years in Area 51. And they do have biological bodies, so they do die. So let's see. So there, and the thing about this also is, these are just the terms that people have come up with. I don't know what these different races call themselves, but this is what we've decided to call them. And then also, I think there have been other EBENs that have crashed and they have, stayed alive, and they have been kept in Area 51. I've also heard of tall grays. So these are also gray beings, but they are just a little taller. And then there's the whole different race of beings that are called insectoid beings. So they basically look like insects. So the ant beings would be one of those. But the one that you probably have heard, or if you haven't heard, talk about the most are the mantis beings. So they basically look like a giant praying mantis. And then, let's see, there's also the Nordics. So they are humanoid, so they look like humans, but they are tall. I believe they're usually blonde hair, blue-eyed, I believe. And then I've also heard of the Venusians, and there was actually one very famous Venusian who incarnated, well, I don't know actually how he came here. He didn't incarnate here. I think he maybe arrived here. I cannot remember that story. It's been years since I read about him. But if you're interested, you can look him up, and I'll include his name in the description. He is human looking, and I think he came here in the 60s, and he was involved with the government, and that's all I can remember. And then, of course, there's the reptilians. And, I think all of us have different roles in this whole, ascension process. And I will say, I think it's good to know about some of these things, but I don't think we necessarily need to focus on them. And so that's the case for me with reptilians. I think it's good to have an understanding, but you don't need to go down the rabbit hole of researching all of the negative stuff because it can get very dark. But I will say that, I don't want to really talk about all of that actually. I will just leave that off the table, and maybe I'll do a video on that at some point, but not right now. And then, now there has been a whole bunch of talk about Antarctica, and I do believe there are different beings down there, and it's been years since I've really spent time looking at that. So I haven't delved that much into it, but all I can say is I think that there's a crashed UFO ship, a mothership or some large ship, I think, that's down there. And I think there may be different beings that live in Antarctica, and I don't know, I can't remember exactly which ones there are down there, but I think there's more than one. The other thing I know about Antarctica, which I've heard, this is what I heard, that there are beings that are in stasis. And I think they're large. I think they're pretty tall, but their bodies are just there, kind of like, in capsules or something. And so it's my understanding that what they do is they keep these bodies down here, these avatars, and then when they want to come here, they put their consciousness into that body, that stasis body, and then they can operate in our environment. Because a lot of what I've understood is a lot of the beings can't take our environment. And that's one thing that I've heard recently, which has been interesting, learning about some of the different beings that are kept at Area 51 because they supposedly have different environmental requirements. And so they, I guess if our people can figure out what environmental needs they have, then they set them up in different things. But anyway, I just heard about that. I knew about the EBEN that had been caught. I've known about that one for a long time, but I'm only learning recently about that there are others. And I think it's just one of those things where I never really thought that much about it. I just thought, everybody talks about Area 51, and I never really got into it that much. And it's only been recently when I've started to hear more about that. And, maybe it's because there's just this kind of collective consciousness of, bubbling up that people, want to know what's really going on. But there is so much to the alien story, and I think it will be interesting to see what they actually disclose, because I can guarantee you they're not going to talk about all of this stuff. I think this is going to be way too much for people. But the thing is that, I'm trying to think about how I navigated it early on. I will just say that when you think about obviously how big the universe is, you know that there's got to be other life there. But I think the biggest thing that I, kind of probably made me think differently was thinking about all of the other stuff that comes with that knowledge. And I will have to think about if I want to go into that or not. But it has been, like I said, I've had years of this to kind of put it together and make it fit in my mind and my paradigm, where it's like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But it certainly was not like that at the beginning. But now I kind of see it as a big picture. I see, we are conscious beings. We are all a part of Source. So we all kind of, come and have our experience. And so I don't freak out about all of the different types of beings that may be out there, because just like, I have the kind of belief that there's a spark of God in everything, and, every creature. Like, I think that, and so that's kind of how I think of it. And we're all just evolving and growing at our own pace and having our own experience. But like I said, it's taken me kind of years, and I will be completely honest with you. I think if I had some of these beings standing in front of me, I probably would, have a panic attack. So I think, it's something that we kind of have to, like, take a little dip, take another little dip, and just kind of start kind of getting used to this idea. And I think, we all have different experiences, and we all have different, um, plans on how we may or may not interact with any of these beings. Um, but, I think it's just the message I just want to say is, I don't think that this is anything to freak out about. And I think, over the next few months, it will be interesting to see, what information actually comes forward. But I will continue to, you know, be confident and understanding that, of course, there's other beings out there, and, whether or not they're negative or positive, there's no difference. I mean, it's the same thing with humans. I mean, we're all kind of evolving at our own pace. So, all right, so that's it for today. I will definitely be talking more about this topic. If there's anything in particular you're interested in talking about this topic, let me know. And I also just want to remind everybody that I do offer coaching. So if you're beginning your spiritual awakening process and you would like guidance through that, I can help with that. So, all right, so that's it for now. Thanks. Bye.